Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of Anthropology and World Problems at Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania screencast. And we had left off last time talking about this ethnographic example from outside of Paris in a suburb. And we're going to continue there and go through a couple more ethnographic examples before concluding this particular segment on crime and punishment. So policing was looked at as a function of the state with diminishing resources. So how to get by overall. So one merchant offered to actually buy the police officers' scooters. This would make it easier for them to catch criminals. And the problem with this, though, was that it would need an official public-private arrangement. And the gift, as we talked about in the section on economic anthropology, alters social relations. So it demonstrated the inability of police to give wholesalers what they wanted, the means to prevent crime. And so one potential solution was that cameras be installed outside of the various Chinese merchants' places of business. So the mayor was essentially relying on the passing of a particular article to allow for filming of public spaces from private buildings. However, this was deemed to be unconstitutional. Basically, it's illegal to record public spaces. And so this idea of public surveillance on private persons was deemed unconstitutional. But the police, rather than enforcing the law about the constitutionality, congratulated the Chinese wholesalers on their purchases. The issues with this, according to the article, essentially the surveillance system has cameras, but there were no trained and dedicated staff to observe. Also, a lot of this information was not shared with the police. Rather, it was used for immediate self-enforcement of security, so vigilante justice. So Tremont really points out some of the ambiguities here of policing, of how the justice system works for these Chinese merchants. As France, in this particular suburb outside of Paris, have diminishing resources, including a lack of a local station to be able to report any type of crimes, and so resorting to individual actions here. Livingstone's 2014 article looks at Brazil, Rio de Janeiro's favelas for the World Cup. The article is titled "Armed Peace," and what this examines is the state's role in policing and preparing cities for international events, and is an example of over-policing. So in the last example, we saw under-policing. Here we see over-policing, mainly of poor, young black men who are being killed by the police under the state's Rio de Janeiro pacification policy. Many of the favelas are under increasingly oppressive control by the pacifying police units. Or proximity policing. So what's going on in this particular setting that Livingstone's looking at is the preparations for the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Olympics. And what that has essentially involved were military occupations of neighborhoods, evictions, as well as gentrification of neighborhoods overall. A lack of promised social investments needed to build the foundations for a lasting peace, and the UPP presence as a pathway to full citizenship and protection of civil rights, basically opening up the favela as a market with telecommunications and electric companies coming in, again, to build the infrastructure for these massive displays, these massive sporting events along the lines of nationalism, as we've talked about in the section on social inequality. Livingstone continues and looks at some of the impacts of UPP. They cite these supposed positives, right, from their own studies, a decrease in homicides and an increase of freedom of movement. But of course, these are specific to particular populations. The negatives from some of these very same studies, as well as others, highlight an increase in homicides of black males who are 3 times more likely to be killed than their white counterparts. High levels of victims shot by police in apparent confrontation. These are rarely investigated, so seemingly outside of the justice system. Livingstone notes that there were 416 of these in 2013. Also, a real concern here is the number of disappearances or individuals that just vanish without a trace, and they're not found. And this is these disappearances have been documented throughout Brazil and Latin America. Police will also impair movement with frequent stop and searches. Again, those are targeted for particular populations. And we'll see the framing of these issues, right? So those that are talking about what the impacts, the disproportionate impacts are on communities, are portrayed as financed and coerced by drug traffickers. So any type of critique of this new order coming in to make the area safe, basically rich person place to celebrate these nationalist events, these sporting events, these basically are looked at as associated with drug traffickers, and hence there's an element of criminality to the very social movements that are protesting this particular type of development in the favela. As the banner reads here, the party in the stadium isn't worth the tears in the favela. So following Giorgio Agamben's 2003 work on exceptions, this becomes a city of exception where the same rules don't quite apply in the context of development. And we'll see this idea of the exception come up in a variety of settings throughout this course where the rules apply until they don't. The final example is Lars Burr's 2003 Crime and Punishment on the Margins of a Post-Apartheid State, looking at South Africa. And this examines basically lack of policing, so under-policing in some areas, and then how essentially vigilante or community justice, vigilante outside the state, but community justice is meted out. So basically how citizens arrange for themselves to be present throughout the process of justice. And one of the things that really becomes apparent in Lars Burr's ethnographic account is that these are very much extrajudicial. So the use of corporal punishment in beatings as legitimate and necessary. He gives this account of a people's court, which is this accessible court, and really demonstrates quite well how individuals are treated basically outside of what we would recognize as appropriate behavior. So basically the courts are held, an individual is brought outside, and those that are sitting in the courtroom can hear the individual is clearly in pain, assumedly being tortured, because he's misremembering a particular event. Comes back into the courtroom, confesses to the crime, and produces, in this instance, 2 brick makers, which are reported as stolen property. It doesn't really matter that they're not the same brick makers, but this becomes a way that justice is supposedly done. And of course, the targeting here goes to the youth, right, who are blamed, the unemployed youth. And what Burr notes here is that in South Africa, since 1994 up until the time of his writing, crime becomes an impediment to development and a catchword basically for everything that has gone wrong with a country. So the police essentially are unable to preserve law and order, And this is where these courts come in, these people's courts that in their own communities determine what justice is. So overall, these two screencasts have covered crime, criminalization, punishment, and by doing so, we can, I think, trace some of the broader contours of what we might mean by justice. We might also think about appropriate forms of punishment. And in the United States, that is boxed in terms of no cruel and unusual punishment under the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. So, how is order to be maintained within society? And we can think about the various institutions that go into producing order in society, but how also this has become professionalized as well as privatized, and what the implications are in terms of incarceration rates in the United States. What does it mean that the United States, as a center of freedom, is also the center of incarceration in the world? And what does that mean even further if we look at particular states within the United States and we see that those incarceration rates are, if those states were considered countries, they would be the highest in the world. And so what are we actually talking about here too when we're talking about particular populations along the lines of race and ethnicity that are disproportionately represented in United States prisons? And what does that mean in terms of maintaining order? And so by looking at some of these different ethnographic examples, these states of exception that are talked about, policing, under-policing, over-policing, what is it that is actually occurring in the United States, and what are the implications in terms of how this might potentially be modified in the future based on what we know today? Thank you.